There's nothing they can do to oversee this particular project. Mr. Speaker, the Premier told this House in the past that this project would fall under the authority of the URB. So, Mr. Speaker, either the Premier doesn't know the full scope of this project, or, Mr. Speaker, he misled this House. So my question to the Premier, which is it?
Honourable the Premier.
It is neither, Mr. Speaker. I said that the project will go to the Utility Review Board, and it will.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Chair of the Utility Review Board said today that the lead company and the only one speaking to them is Emera, not Nova Scotia Power. And he was very clear to the committee of this House that no one from Nova Scotia Power has contacted the Utility Review Board and that they would have no oversight over that project. So maybe the Premier could stand in this House and clarify if he knows something that the Chair of the Utility Review Board doesn't.
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do, and that is that the project will go to the Utility and Review Board for review as I direct.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the only way that that project can go to the Utility and Review Board is either it's being built by Nova Scotia Power or, Mr. Speaker, we change legislation. And since this government has brought forward no legislation, we've had a weak legislative agenda, Mr. Speaker. It would have been nice to have a substantive piece of legislation that we could have debated, but we've had a weak piece of legislation. So my question to the Premier, is he going to change the legislation or what?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, because the Leader of the Opposition does not understand the options, I'm not going to bother to explain them. But, Mr. Speaker, there are, in fact, other ways that this project could come to the Utility Review Board. But further to that, if it requires that there are regulatory change to ensure that the project comes to the Utility Review Board, we will see that that is done.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in committee today, the Chair of the Public Utility Board stated clearly that they may not review the Muskrat Falls project depending on how it is financed. That is a clear contradiction to what the Premier told all Nova Scotians prior to today. Now we hear him say that they will. And so my question to the Premier, why did the Premier tell Nova Scotians that it was the job of the Utility Review Board to review that project when in fact it isn't?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that that question was written before question period, and certainly now that he's had the benefit of listening to the answers to the question that were put to the Leader of the Opposition, he should know that I intend to direct that project is in fact reviewed by the Utility and Review Board as was always planned and expected by Nova Scotians, and that is what will happen.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador has already done her job protecting the ratepayers of Newfoundland by directing their Utility and Review Board to do a cost-benefit analysis of that project. An analysis, by the way, that was pretty sketchy about whether it worked for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. Up till today, the Premier of Nova Scotia, the person who was responsible for standing up for Nova Scotia ratepayers, has failed to do the same. Only today, when he was contradicted by the Chair of our Utility and Review Board, does he say that he may. So my question to the Premier, when will he do for Nova Scotia what he's failed to do up till now and follow the lead of his compatriot in Newfoundland?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Conservative Party hears only conveniently what he wants to hear. We have always said that this review will be undertaken by the Utility and Review Board. Mr. Speaker, in fact, there have been numerous reviews that have already come forward as a result of Newfoundland and Labrador's engagement that have talked about the benefits of the Utility and Review Board. And I have told the Leader of the Conservative Party numerous times that the final contract between Nova Scotia Power and Emera and Nalcor have not been finalized, and until the costs are known and until it is finalized, it is not possible to do the kind of review that he asked for.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it was almost a year ago that the Premier of Nova Scotia committed this province and all of the ratepayers in it to the Muskrat Falls project, a project that everyone has hopes for, but the fact of the matter is he does not know how much the cost of power from Muskrat Falls will be. Now we know today it is not the job of the Utility and Review Board to tell Nova Scotians how much it will cost, or even to determine whether it's affordable for Nova Scotians. It's certainly not Emera's, and it's certainly not Nova Scotia Power's. It is his job. It's been almost a year. Will he commit in this House today to telling Nova Scotians how much power from that project will cost before another dollar is spent developing it?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps I'll use smaller words when I'm speaking. I have already said to the Leader of the Conservative Party that what will happen is that there will be a review. It will be done by the Utility and Review Board. And, Mr. Speaker, you can't review a project for which the costs are not yet known. The final contract is not yet known. I point out to the Leader of the Conservative Party, in addition to the benefits that have been identified for the electricity ratepayers here in the province in terms of stability over 35 years, this morning in public accounts, the chairman of the Utility Review Board, when he was asked what the cheapest power he had was in the system, he said it was hydro.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, my question is also for the Premier. Unfortunately, what the Chair said was not that it's hydro. It is hydro from the stations that already exist in Nova Scotia, and he specifically excluded Muskrat Falls in his follow-up statement. But that being said, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is right that this can be an important process, and it's not smaller words we need, it's accurate words in the same statement. Because on April 4th, the Premier stood in this House and said, and I quote in response to a question about this from another member, he knows full well there is a comprehensive review process that the project, before it can be approved as a capital expenditure for the utility, it has to go to the Utility and Review Board. That is the appropriate process for the review, and I will table that. What we learned today from the chair of the board is that no such process exists, and that the only method under which that can currently happen, since it is an Emera project, is if the government not changes regulation, but amends Section 35 of the Public Utilities Act to include this project or Emera. That was the exact words of the chair of the board standing outside. So, Mr. Speaker, this is very simple. Will the Premier amend the Public Utilities Act to ensure that the commitment he has made to Nova Scotians that this will go to the Utility and Review Board actually happens?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for all of his assertions, he's wrong. This, in fact, is a project that will go to the Utility and Review Board, just as I said it would. It will. There will be a review, Mr. Speaker, and we're looking forward to it because we believe that once the review is complete, the folly of the opposition in their criticism of this project is completely unfounded.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our criticism is not of this project, it's of the fact that government believes that Nova Scotians should not be kept informed about it and given honest answers. It's quite simple. The fact is the Premier has said things which the chair of the board has said are simply untrue. The chair of the board has said that there are elements of this project that no matter what the Premier orders, they do not have the jurisdiction to review, no matter what. But he did say that there is an opportunity here to review this project if the government amends Section 35 of the Public Utilities Act to ensure this project is completed. As it stands now, it's an Emera project, or it will be a project done by a new Emera company. Neither of those are covered by that section, and the chair was very clear about that. So, Mr. Speaker, why will the Premier not agree to make this easy and amend that section of the board or the act so that the review is mandated by law?
Hear, hear. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've done my best to explain to the member opposite why he's wrong. He doesn't seem to want to accept that, but he is wrong, and that was not what the chair of the Utility and Review Board said, Mr. Speaker. He was speaking hypothetically. The fact of the matter is that no application, of course, has been made yet, but what I want to assure the members of the House and the members of the public is that I've said that this matter will be reviewed by the Utility Review Board. and it will.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier thinks that I'm going to believe him over the chair of the Utility and Review Board after the litany of broken promises from this government, he must be living in la-la land. Because the fact of the matter is, the chair of the board was very, very clear about this. He said it's only Amira. Mr. Speaker, he's very clear. He said it's only Amira that's talked to him. Amira stood down at the Marriott and said it will be either Amira or it will be a separate company. Mr. Bennett has not talked about it as a Nova Scotia Power Company, and he said the only way it would ever get reviewed under the current situation is as a fuel cost, and because they have to look at long-term fuel cost, it would probably then get refused. So, and Mr. Speaker, we know that there are other benefits associated with it. This is easily solved. All the Premier has to do is bring in an amendment to the Public Utilities Act to address this issue that the chair of the board has raised in here and raised outside with the media. Why won't he do it?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, there is no application, as has been pointed out by the chair of the board. It has not been, we don't fix imaginary problems, Mr. Speaker. We fix real problems. This is not one of those. I have said that it will be reviewed by the Utility and Review Board, and it will be reviewed by the Utility and Review Board. And as for the member from Dartmouth East being in La La Land, I concur with that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in 2009, prior to the election of 2009, Mr. Speaker, the Premier told Nova Scotians that he would remove the HST off of heating electricity bills, Mr. Speaker, to the tune of about $28 million, Mr. Speaker. Following the election campaign, Mr. Speaker, the Premier then told Nova Scotians he was going to introduce an NDP electricity tax, which would add $40 million to power bills across the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So give a little with one hand, or take a little with one hand, Mr. Speaker, and then give a little back. My question to the Premier, why did the Premier fail to tell Nova Scotians that he was going to add $40 million to electricity bills across this province before they did?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this morning at the Utility and Review Board, the chairman of the Utility Review Board was asked about how he would go about having stable and cheaper rates for Nova Scotians. And you know what he said, Mr. Speaker? He said through demand-side management, Mr. Speaker, which is exactly what that efficiency company does.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we would agree with the chair of the Utility Review Board. What we don't agree with is this government that has decided it's every ratepayer that should pay for it. We believe the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power should pay for it. Mr. Speaker, since the Premier is unwilling to recognize his own mistake and force the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power to pay for the NDP electricity tax, we at least guarantee Nova Scotians that he will freeze it and it will not continue to rise.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the demand-side management charge was designed and was implemented as a result of the decision of the Utility and Review Board and had nothing to do with the government of Nova Scotia. In fact, the government of Nova Scotia are the ones who removed the tax from electricity, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table for you and for the edification of the members opposite the testimony of Mr. Krandelmeyer from Efficiency Nova Scotia with respect to this matter. He said that energy efficiency improvements made in 2011 will save Nova Scotians about $100 million in electricity costs and efficiency improvements in 2012 and will spur $40 million worth of economic activity in the province, work for electricians, carpenters, insulators, plumbers, and more from Yarmouth to Amherst.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm hearing people around the House saying, and who does he work for, Mr. Speaker? I think we all know the answer, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, no one is questioning the fact that demand-side management should exist. The question is who should pay for it. The government on the other side believes every ratepayer in Nova Scotia should pay for it. We, quite frankly, believe the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power should pay for it. Mr. Speaker, before the 2009 election, the Premier said he didn't want the DSM charge, Mr. Speaker, and then he put it on every power bill, Mr. Speaker, every month. Before the 2009 election, Mr. Speaker, he said he wouldn't raise the HST, Mr. Speaker, then he did it mere months after being elected Premier. Before the 2009 election campaign, he voted against giving big oil a tax break, Mr. Speaker. A few months ago, Mr. Speaker, he handed out a $10 million tax-free money to big oil, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so my question to the Premier, how can we trust the NDP government will help the people of this province against higher power rates when you've broken your promise so many times to the people of this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all of the litany of things that he has said are distortions of the fact, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the fact of the matter is the oil refinery in Dartmouth got no money from the government whatsoever. The highest taxed refinery east of Manitoba was not charged more tax, Mr. Speaker. We are the ones who took the HST off of home energy. We are the ones who put in place the affordability tax credits. We are the ones who raised the allowances for those who are disabled and those who are the poorest in our society, Mr. Speaker. We're the ones who took income tax off for seniors who pay GIS. That was this government. Those crowd over there voted against all those things.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, the NDP told Nova Scotians they were moving jobs from Halifax to rural Nova Scotia, including maintenance enforcement jobs. But it turns out, Mr. Speaker, that's just not the case. The fact is, those 25 jobs are coming from the communities of Amherst, from New Glasgow, and from Canfield, not Halifax. In fact, the only place that jobs are not coming from is the Department of Justice's head office on Terminal Road in Halifax. My question to the Premier, why does his government claim to be moving jobs like these from Halifax to rural Nova Scotia when in fact they're doing no such thing?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have no idea where the Leader of the Conservative Party got his information, but he's wrong. Jobs are coming out of their head office, which is in Dartmouth, and they are going to New Waterford.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Premier might want to have a chat once in a while with his own Minister of Justice, because the fact of the matter is the centres that are consolidating in New Waterford are in New Glasgow, are in Kentville, and are in Amherst. They are not in Halifax. There is one in Dartmouth, but the government, when it added up its 93 jobs, included all 25 maintenance enforcement jobs, and that is simply not the case. And I focus on Kentville for a reason, because the Annapolis Valley has lost 5,500 full-time jobs in the last 3 years, according to Statistics Canada, a 10% decline in their workforce. The Premier and his government play a cruel game of telling them that they're moving jobs around when they're doing no such thing. How many of those jobs came from Kentville in the Annapolis Valley and not from Halifax, as his government alleges?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the consolidation takes place regardless of where those jobs go, because this was being consolidated. So the question was, where was it going to be consolidated? Now, in the past, every consolidation that the Conservatives did came into Halifax. For us, Mr. Speaker, we are going to consolidate those jobs and the jobs from Dartmouth, and they are going to New Waterford, to be clear.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice told all Nova Scotians through the media just outside this chamber, and I will quote directly, "We made a promise that we're going to move jobs from the city into the rural areas to balance out the economy of Nova Scotia." In fact, he is doing no such thing. It is just a cruel joke. So I will ask the Premier, does he condone the behaviour of a minister that tells Nova Scotia that he's doing one thing when in fact he is doing the other?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the jobs from the Maintenance Enforcement Program in Dartmouth, there are other areas that are being consolidated in Cape Breton, and that is good for Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, in addition, the jobs from the head office in agriculture are going to Truro. The Marine Division of the Department of Fisheries is going to Digby. The Aquaculture Division is going to Shelburne, and all of those are good jobs in rural Nova Scotia. Unlike the Conservative government that are slashing jobs in rural Nova Scotia, as they did at the Fortress of Louisbourg and Cape Breton, as they have done at the Department of Indian Affairs in Amherst, as they go about destroying jobs in Nova Scotia, we are creating them.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And
your microphone's not on yet, is it?
Oh, it is. It is, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for recognizing me. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Listen, when we ask about the NDP's new electricity tax, the best that they can come up with is to suggest the Liberals are against conservation. And this is ridiculous. And the funny thing is that they'll table quotes out of context. I'll table the complete transcript from public accounts of the other week where we make it abundantly clear that we absolutely support conservation. What we do not support is taxing ratepayers to death and letting shareholders run away with record profits. You know, Mr. Speaker, this is about who pays. And that's all it's about. It's about who pays for this. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell us why he believes that Nova Scotia ratepayers should be the one to pay for conservation instead of Nova Scotia Power's shareholders?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the concern, I think, for everyone in this House is to ensure that there are lower and stable prices on behalf of ratepayers in Nova Scotia. It should be abundantly obvious, even to the member for Dartmouth East, that if you pay $40 million and you get $100 million of savings, that is a good deal for ratepayers.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first
Mr. Speaker, and it's an even better deal when that $40 million is paid by shareholders and not ratepayers. You know, Mr. Speaker, let me quote from a document dated June 3rd, 2009. I am making this representation on behalf of the New Democratic Party. The NDP is of the view that DSM, dated April 6, 2009, is a burden of the DSM-related improvements, which is too heavily on residential users and other rate classes. It should be rather based on the notion that the utility will bear the costs for making DSM-related investments in order to stabilize its long-term position in the market and to access power for consumers of all classes. This is signed on behalf of the Premier by Mr. Dan O'Connor, which I will now table. And there was six days before the... So, Mr. Speaker, 6 days before the election, the NDP said that shareholders should pay the DSM charges, and yet after the election, they tabled an act which had ratepayers pay it. So, Mr. Speaker, why was it wrong during the election to have ratepayers pay this fee, but then, once he became government, charging shareholders was wrong and charging ratepayers was right?
Honourable the Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, as he did mention, that was in fact a submission to the Utility and Review Board, and like all parties, we have the opportunity to make a submission to the Utility and Review Board, and after we do that, Mr. Speaker, we live with the decision of the Utility and Review Board.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
See, Mr. Speaker, I knew that the Premier was going to answer that, and it's unfortunate that this morning the Chair of the Review Board said the Premier is absolutely wrong when he says that. In fact, he said this morning that this act, which was introduced by the NDP, which I will table, left the board no choice but to charge ratepayers and left them with no option but to charge shareholders. He said it was a result of the NDP Act, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, let's try this one more time, and maybe we can have a bit of accurate information since the NDP passed that act and the chair said they didn't make that decision. Mr. Speaker, why does the NDP believe ratepayers should pay for conservation programs instead of shareholders of a company with record profits earned on the backs of hard-working Nova Scotians?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the member for Dartmouth East was actually at the hearing this morning, but I think he needs to go back and review the transcript or something, because that's not what they said, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what the chairman of the Utility and Review Board actually said was that DSM charges, that the demand-side management program was in fact one of the best ways to control costs for consumers.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Premier said that job cuts at Capital Health may be needed to pay for the settlement ratified by the local union last Friday. That prompted today the President of the Nova Scotia Government Employees Union, Ms. Joan Jessam, to say, and I quote, "That wasn't part of the deal." And I will table that quote from the media for the benefit of the House. Well, Mr. Speaker, the deal negotiated by Dave Collins, the lead negotiator for Capital Health, did not deal with job cuts, leaving many Nova Scotians to wonder, what deal is Ms. Jessam now referring to? So I will ask the Premier, what deal has the Premier made that Ms. Jessam is referring to when she says that wasn't part of the deal that Nova Scotians don't yet know about?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if the leader of the Conservative Party has a question for Joan Jessam, I think he should ask Joan Jessam.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's not on my speed dial like we all know she is on his speed dial. Mr. Speaker, it became apparent this week that the Premier agreed to this deal with local... It became apparent this week that the Premier agreed to this deal with the Capital Health Union without even knowing the full cost to his government of implementing the deal. That is why many Nova Scotians are wondering what deal Ms. Jessam is referring to. She is not here, but the Premier is, so I will ask him, what involvement did his office have in negotiating a backdoor deal with Local 42, other than the one that Mr. Collins was supposedly responsible for, that Ms. Jessam now feels a deal he broke?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say the leader of the Conservative Party has a very active imagination, but it doesn't serve him very well in these circumstances. The healthcare negotiations were well managed. They proceeded in a purposeful and predictable manner. They resulted in a settlement which was satisfactory to the parties. What I said yesterday, I think, is just blindingly obvious. If you have a finite amount of money and salaries are your biggest wage costs, then the increase in wages means that you don't have enough, as much money for salaried employees. But what I also said yesterday, and of course, as we all know, in scrums, and there are some things that get reported and some things that do not, I also mentioned that we would support the budgets of the DHAs. They framed them up on the basis of a certain set of expectations, and we appreciate the work they've done, and we're going to support that. But I also said that there is an opportunity here for the employees in that local and in the district health authority to come forward now and to help us find further efficiencies, further ways of merging services and be able to deliver services that will cut those costs, much as we have already done with the merged services that people have already seen and the savings that we have already achieved.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, just to talking about active imaginations, I just want to assure you, sir, that I continue to imagine a day when we'll get a straight answer from the other side of the House to simple questions like this. Regardless, Mr. Speaker, of what deals were done, all Nova Scotians remain wondering who is going to pay for it all. Capital Health budgeted 1%. We know that the actual settlement is multiples of that number. Either Capital Health and their patients will pay through cuts to programs and jobs, or all Nova Scotians are going to pay when the Premier tops up the budget for Capital Health. So here is a simple question, and I imagine a straightforward answer. Which is it? Who will pay for that deal?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the leader of the Conservative Party knows, there are cost pressures in every department every year as a result of increased costs that come in many forms and to a large degree as a result of contracts that have been signed that have rolling increases in them, and those are of course beyond the control of a government when it is done by the government before you. You simply pick up where they left off and therefore have to deal with the mess that was left behind by the former government. In our case, Mr. Speaker, this government had to deal with a $1.4 billion structural deficit left behind by the former Conservative government.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, my question is for the Premier. The Premier's had the night to reflect and think about question period yesterday, I hope, and his incorrect statement that enacting the 51st recommendation of the Energy Market Governance Committee to allow renewable energy suppliers to sell to consumers would be deregulation, which is what he tried to suggest yesterday. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask him again and give him a chance to correct his statements. Does the Premier still believe that renewable to retail, which would introduce competition to Nova Scotia Power and break their monopoly, and was recommended by that committee, is the same as deregulation?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, the Liberal Party has a comprehensive plan for deregulation of the electricity market that will, in fact, mean that Nova Scotians will pay higher electricity costs. If I'm wrong, then they should tell me that. But I can tell you this about that recommendation and when it was made. When that recommendation was made, the electricity profile of this province looked entirely different. And in fact, the recommendation that was made at the time was to allow electricity consumers to pay a higher price, a premium for green electricity, Mr. Speaker. So it would not, in fact, bring prices down. In fact, for those people who chose to buy green power under that model, the price would actually be higher.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier should try reading our bill because this caucus has never mentioned deregulation, in fact, we've suggested better regulation, better and more regulation of the energy industry, not less. So, not like this crowd who basically wants to abdicate their responsibility. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering also whether the Premier talks to members of his caucus, because the Deputy Premier said, quote, "When is your government going to ensure renewable energy suppliers can sell their product at a fair price in this province?" Then he said, the minister hasn't come up within a mile of talking about Section 51 of the Electricity Governance Market Committee. The minister has chosen to ignore this report and the impact it will have on the ability for these people to sell energy. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Premier suggested that the Liberals want deregulation because we've introduced the bill that the Deputy Premier suggested should go forward. So, Mr. Speaker, is the Premier saying the Deputy Premier is wrong?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as you know, I would not do that, Mr. Speaker. But what I will do, Mr. Speaker, is I will table. I'm sure the member for Dartmouth East is aware of what was actually said in the report with respect to recommendation number 51, and this is what it says. It says, What it says is that in a fully competitive market, any seller could offer green energy at a higher price, but would face the price competition from sellers. Consumers could then choose whether or not they wish to pay a green energy premium, Mr. Speaker, meaning that they would pay more for green energy, Mr. Speaker. Though that recommendation is no longer necessary, and the bill is no longer necessary because, Mr. Speaker, we have increased the level of green energy in the province, and it is now part of the portfolio that every Nova Scotian gets when it buys its electricity.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has introduced the higher prices, but he hasn't introduced the competition that was meant to go with it and make it work. And then he has the audacity to suggest that that bill, which the NDP supported in opposition, is deregulation, which couldn't be further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, let me also table the comments of the member for Halifax-Chebucto, also supporting the bill in this House. Mr. Speaker, I guess he was wrong too. Mr. Speaker, the Premier thinks that we can't have renewable energy in a regulated market. But New Brunswick has both, and it's working just fine. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table their act that's working there. So, Mr. Speaker, what does he think is wrong with Nova Scotia's government that we can't have a competent renewable to retail system while still having a regulated market, just like his caucus members suggested, and just like they have in New Brunswick?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals were going to deregulate the market. Now the member for Dartmouth East says they're going to put in place even more regulation. Well, you know something, Mr. Speaker, they don't need more regulation. What they need is what they got, which is a comprehensive renewable electricity policy, which is what they got, and not something that was obsolete because this government did a better job.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In a desperate attempt to divert attention away from her own mistakes, the Minister of Community Services misinformed the House about a report on the Cheticon Association for Community Living. The disclaimer of the Cheticon report reads, quote, "The report resulting from the review is submitted and received by the board in confidence and is embargoed until the board and DCS have discussed the findings and recommendations." End of quote. The disclaimer on the Talbot House review says, and I quote, "The report contains confidential and identifiable personal information. Disclosure of this review by the Department of Community Services is governed by the provisions of the FOIPOP Act." And I'll table those two very different disclaimers. So my question to the Minister used her response to my colleague's final supplementary question to delude this House. Can she point out to any reference to personal information in the Cheticon report?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter how they continually fabricate, twist facts. It's a disclaimer, and the disclaimers are regular disclaimers that are utilized when we do such reports, and we had discussions with the board, and so we did the right thing.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And trying to make the Minister understand, I'll give her an example of an identifiable example of identifiable information. If I were to say, and I quote, "The Premier is a job-killing mismanager of Nova Scotia's economy," end of quote, everyone would know that I'm referring to the member for Cole Harbour. Can the Minister finally see how 7 statements in the Talbot House report make veiled suggestions of inappropriate behaviour by the well-known Executive Director of Talbot House, of which there was only one was wrong?
There's only one guy.
It's only one guy.
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, if you look at the Camp report that the member from Argyle also put online, it references the executive director in there. It looks at the same thing. It looks at policy. It looks at policy. So anybody reading the one that he also put online could also identify that executive director in the community. So there is no difference in those reviews that were put online.
The honourable member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
Listen, Mr. Speaker, in the report for Talbot House, there are 7 different instances of veiled suggestions of inappropriate behaviour. In the Shady Camp one, of course, there was nothing like that in there. Members from this party have stood in this House tabling highlighted excerpts from the reports, tabling the minister's own words. We've even tabled enacted legislation that the minister has violated, and she still doesn't seem to understand, nor her colleagues in the front benches understand that she is wrong. She sticks to the messaging. She tries desperately to divert attention away from her mistakes. She blames an official, but it isn't working, Mr. Speaker. The minister cannot create a distraction when she has broken the law. It's time for her to admit it. Will the minister accept her ministerial responsibility and admit her handling of the Talbot House review was illegal?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the facts are the facts are the facts. When you read the review, it talks about policy. It talks about policy, whether there's an admission policy, whether there's job descriptions. If you also read the Shady Camp review, it says the same thing, whether there's a job description. It's unbelievable that they want to they're twisting their story so many times that they're even getting mixed up in their own twisted facts, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This winter, many Nova Scotians have had to turn to the Good Neighbour Energy Fund to be able to heat their homes and turn on their lights. The last day to apply for this assistance was April 30th, but the fund was depleted by April 17th, and this was the second time this fund was depleted this year. Mr. Speaker, this fund had never been depleted before. So, Mr. Speaker, the fund received a top-up of $400,000 2 months ago and then ran out of money again with over a week left of the program. People who needed help with their power bills were being turned away. My question, how is it acceptable to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia that so many Nova Scotians needed assistance paying their power bills that the fund was depleted twice this season?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It's a good one. The Good Neighbour Fund is not run by government. It is the generosity of the people through the government to give money to the Salvation Army that runs that fund. We made 2 installments, if I can use that word, of $400,000. The initial plan was to give them $400,000. They used that up fairly quickly. We had the capacity to offer more, and we did do that. Do we like the fact that Nova Scotians find themselves in difficulty? We don't, Mr. Speaker. I think the use of the fund applies more to oil than it does to electricity, but that could yet be verified. So I want to say, if it was possible to do more, I think we'd very much like to do more, but whatever we can do, we try to do it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The increased need for the Good Neighbour Energy Fund speaks volumes about the need for this government to act to make power more affordable for Nova Scotians. Now, last year, 1,808 families accessed this fund. This year, 2,752 families had to use it. Mr. Speaker, that's 944 more families that needed to use this assistance because they couldn't pay their power bills. Will the Minister of Service Nova Scotia stand up for Nova Scotians, call on his cabinet colleagues to break the Nova Scotia power monopoly and reduce the need for so many people to seek help with their power bills?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as much as I respect the member opposite when she raises issues, I think she does a good job. But I have not gotten myself to a place that just because she says that, it means it's true. The condition on which she speaks, I don't think anybody can say, I don't think she can say, is related to power rates in Nova Scotia. I think this fund is more exclusively used for people who are having trouble paying their oil bill, not their electricity bill.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not enough to keep topping up the assistance fund. Since 2001, power rates have gone up 40%. The previous government did nothing to ease the burden of power rates on Nova Scotians, and this government isn't doing anything either. We're not talking about power taxes, we're talking about power rates. Power rates are unmanageable, and as a result, the Good Neighbour Energy Fund was depleted twice this season. Mr. Speaker, will this government do what the former government refused to do and do something, anything, to make power rates more affordable and break the monopoly of Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if the member opposite missed something in the budgeting process a couple years back, but this government took the provincial portion of the HST off of home heating to give a benefit to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, something that the members of that party voted against.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister for Economic and Rural Development and Tourism gave no indication that he understands the concern of business in this province. He deflected questions on our struggling economy, important questions which businesses are very concerned about. Time after time, businesses point to the cost of electricity as their main concern. Skyrocketing power rates are putting our economy and our future at risk, Mr. Speaker. So my question: why has the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism been ignoring the increasing cost of power, which impacts businesses in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues are saying I should send that question over to the Minister of Energy, but I'm going to stand here, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to say that we are very much in tune with what's going on in the province of Nova Scotia when it comes to business, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've made, under the Jobs Here strategy, we've made huge investment not only in human resources in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, but we've made huge investments, Mr. Speaker, in capital spending. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, the investments that we made in jobs. And, you know, I can speak about the thousands of jobs, Mr. Speaker, that we invest in that could stay here in Nova Scotia, in rural Nova Scotia, when it comes to Bowater, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we make those investments all the time. What we've done, Mr. Speaker, after 20 years of non-economic growth, Mr. Speaker, we've managed to turn the ship around.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the Minister reverts back to his lines about how well they've done with the economy and they've turned things around after so many years of devastation by the Liberals and the Tories. Yeah. Hang on. Just hang on for a second. The government side can just wait, because what they should understand is that there's really, the background noise won't help get rid of the fact and forget about the fact that we've got 0.3% growth in our GDP, Mr. Speaker. You can use all the lines you want. You can talk about jobs here. The minister can stand up and say things are getting better, things are turning around. We're the second worst performing province in this country with GDP, which is the key measure of economic growth. 0.3%, Mr. Speaker. So you're in tune with businesses and you're in tune with the economy? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. At way less than 1% growth in this country. The minister's record is clearly one of a stalled economy. Power rates continue to climb and businesses continue to struggle under your watch. In the last year, the minister has done nothing more than come up with catchy slogans that he uses over and over. 0.3% GDP, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister, why does this minister have absolutely no strategy for addressing rising electricity rates in this province, which affects businesses in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will toss the ball on that question over to the Minister of Energy, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in spite of what the honourable member says, we do have a plan in this province. We're dealing with the energy costs, and I know we're all concerned, whether a homeowner or a small business or a large industrial, but we're doing a whole variety of issues here as government to combat ever-increasing power rates, things like the Lower Churchill project, natural gas replacement for coal, our ComFit program, our renewable electricity administrator for the IPPs, efficiency in Nova Scotia. There's a whole suite of programs for small business, large business and homeowners, renewable policy. I could go on, but there's just a whole suite of alternatives here that are fighting the cost of power in this province.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that we are a struggling economy. Our GDP has almost experienced flat growth last year. Under this minister's watch, under this department, we spent $120 million last year. We're about to spend $190 million this year, Mr. Speaker. So my question is simple to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. How does this minister explain 0.3% GDP growth for the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise to my place again and boast about the record of this government when it comes to jobs, when it comes to employee training in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to regional employment, these are the facts, Mr. Speaker. In the first 3 months, compared to last year, Cape Breton, guess what? It decreased by 2.7%, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? That is a trend that exists right across in every region of this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has made huge investments in employment, in jobs, in growing the economy, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do that. We are on the right track. We are going to stay the course, and we are going to watch this economy grow and grow and grow.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at a recent community meeting in Dartmouth North, some alarming numbers were presented to the public centred on recent test scores and the overall educational experience by our young people. Mr. Speaker, recent grade 3 assessments for reading comprehension in Halifax Regional Municipality schools, we've seen students meet expectations by 75%. In comparison, students at Harbourview Elementary scored only 60%, and John McNeil 52, Shannon Park 41. In math, Mr. Speaker, was no different. HRM schools met expectations by 72%, but at Harbourview it was 54% and John McNeil only 42%. Mr. Speaker, students in Dartmouth North need help. So my question to the Minister of Education, is she truly convinced that spending $500,000 plus on orange lunch bags is going to help these grade 3 students and students going into grade 3?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite asked a number of questions, but I thank him very much for the opportunity to explain that we're investing in our students by providing materials going home with families to our preschool students as they register for school that will enhance the opportunities for them to engage in language and it's reading materials, it's music, it's a number of things that have been very carefully researched by the reading specialists across Nova Scotia. It's an investment of $35 for every preschool student going into our school, an investment that I stand behind, and I hope that people that are really and want our students to do the very best they can stand with me. Thank you.
Member for Dartmouth North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, grade 6 students in Dartmouth North are faring no better. HRM schools for reading test scores met expectations by 81%, compared to 50% for Harbourview and 56% for John McNeil. In math scores, HRM met expectations by 61%, but Harbourview elementary students fell to 22% and John McNeil 27%. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain to the House how our NDP government can cut $65 million out of the education budget and not have it negatively affecting these students?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are investing our students. Our Kids and Learning First plan actually has identified the fact that we need to have targeted investments in our students. We are going in at grade 3, grade 6, and grade 9 to see where our students are so that we know where to put our supports. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to many it would seem as though the students in Dartmouth North are simply failing. But I believe that it's deep cuts to the education budget made by this NDP government who are failing them. Mr. Speaker, can the minister assure the House and the students of Dartmouth North that she will stop the cut and paste exercise and truly put Nova Scotia students and students in Dartmouth North first?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're making sure that we're putting investments in all of our students, and our students in Dartmouth North are as important as every student in this province. We are targeting our investments. We are making sure that we're providing opportunities for our students. We have made sure that we have options and opportunities. We are increasing our skills trades. We are making sure that we're checking in at the grade 3, grade 6, and grade 9, not just to see where our students are, but where we can put more resources so that we can make sure that every student is successful within our system. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Yesterday, the Premier indicated the inevitable result of an arbitrated decision around wages for CDHA healthcare workers will be job cuts. He went on to say these cuts will impact patients and the services they receive, although in true Premier-like style, he was not clear. Given that Capital Health's business plan has been prepared for a 1% increase and the plan has not yet been approved by Cabinet, could the Premier please indicate whether his government has sent the business plan back to Capital Health for even more cuts?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was perfectly clear when I spoke yesterday. I said that we would support the business plans that came forward from the District Health Authority. We have, though, an ongoing dialogue with them. They know that we are concerned about the manner in which wage costs are going. We understand that they have a job to deliver services. We have said that we would like to engage the employees themselves. So oftentimes those people on the front lines are the ones who know best how to help resolve some of these problems. But we have an issue in this province with respect to the finances of our province. The simple fact of the matter is that we were left with a terrible mess where the expenses that we have far outstrip the revenues that we have. So we're committed to getting that under control. The District Health Authority knows that. The unions representing the workers know it. I assume that the opposition knows it, although some days you wouldn't be so sure.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this story gets potentially worse. You see, there is a clause in the new agreement, Article 32.23 to be exact, which I will table, which has a layoff exception. The clause states that any worker with 8 years' experience can't be laid off, except where the layoff is beyond the control of the employer. Fire, explosions and destruction or breakdown of machinery are examples cited in the clause as beyond the control of the employer. Balancing the budget for this NDP government is not. If the Premier knew that layoffs were the end result of this agreement, why did he approve a clause that would potentially see the youngest workers bear the brunt of the impact?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is exactly the way that these clauses work in labour relations. The fact of the matter is that there are bumping rights, there are seniority clauses in almost every contract. That's not, that's not out of the ordinary. This is the same kind of thing that would have been negotiated by former governments of both stripes. Mr. Speaker, there are people out there who want to suspend reality and try and suggest that there are no consequences with respect to the decisions that are made. There are always consequences, and the reality is that we, as a government, take the view that we must face those, and we must be clear and upfront both with our workers and with the people of Nova Scotia. So what I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I thought was, as I said before, blindingly obvious, but perhaps I'm wrong.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this clause 32.23 has the potential to negatively impact retention and recruitment of new and young workers at a time when we can ill afford to do so, and the Premier knows it. This government already laid off youth mental health workers at the IWK with 6 or 7 years' experience, so it is certainly in keeping with his government's mandate. Given that, once again, we are in a situation where the wage decision is out of government's control. And this Premier knows full well the wage increase built into the business plan will not suffice, even if the arbitrator rules for the wage increase on the lowest end of the scale. Will the Premier clarify once and for all, will the government be approving a business plan that will have even more job cuts and loss of services than previously anticipated, or will his government cover the bill for capital health? Which is it, Mr. Premier?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll say again that we will support the business plans that have come forward from the District Health Authority, but the simple reality is that the District Health Authorities and the Department of Health have a partnership where they seek to resolve issues both with respect to service delivery and with respect to the resources that are committed to that service delivery. I think this is what the people of Nova Scotia expect. They expect that we will respect their need for service, but they also expect that we will respect the fact that every cent that we spend in healthcare comes right out of their pockets.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in response to the NDP and their decision to tear up the municipal MOU last year, towns and municipalities are being forced in a position of raising taxes. We know that Queen's municipalities institute a 3% hike because of the NDP. Queen's is not alone. The municipality of Digby will incur $136,525 more in expenditures this year because of the decision of the NDP to tear up the MOU. This added pressure on the municipalities already struggling to keep up with the added costs such as raising power costs, wastewater treatment and supports to organizations. My question is to Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Why is the minister intent on balancing the province books on the backs of the municipalities and on property tax owners?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're doing no such thing. Actually, I spoke with members from the UNSM today, and I think some members of the House as well. The situation actually has been that I think many municipal units have not raised the rate for their taxpayers. There is no indication that any changes to the MOU have caused increase in rates for taxpayers. And as far as Queens go, I think there's some infrastructure, new infrastructure they're building there that would that's their choice to increase the rate to help cover those costs. But We are considering all Nova Scotians and all taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, there's only one taxpayer for all three levels of government, and so this government actually has considered their concerns. They have about 140 million surplus among the municipal units, and I think that they are not being penalized by this government.
The honourable member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a 3% increase in Queens, an additional 3 cents on the residential tax rate in Digby, and the County of Colchester they are facing with shortfalls due entirely to the minister's decision to tear up the municipal MOU. This coming year, the County of Colchester is facing a $529,907 shortfall. This means an additional 2.59 cents on both the residential and commercial tax rates. Faced with increasing service requirements, increased power costs, municipalities are struggling with the NDP's Minister breach of faith on the MOU, and residents are paying more property taxes. My question to the minister is, will the minister admit his decision to tear up the MOU is resulting in higher taxes for residents?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very difficult for me to admit something that's not true. The issue of the MOU, as the member opposite describes it, is my tearing it up. If he was to examine it, he would actually see there is a clause in the MOU that allows the government to move away if they cannot afford it. That was not signed by this government. It was signed by a former member of the Conservative government with the UNSM. They can't avoid what was actually written in the agreement, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 3% in Queens, an additional 3 cents on the residential tax rate in Digby, an additional 2.59 cents in both residential commercial tax rate in the County of Colchester. This is what the minister's decision means, and it adds up. The municipality of Argyle is faced with difficult decisions around service delivery. Nova Scotians across the province are faced with paying more for less thanks to this NDP government. My question is, will the minister reconsider his decision to tear up the MOU?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The state of the MOU is the state of the MOU going forward. Municipal units actually have gotten a break on their corrections costs. The province absorbed $4 million in costs that the municipal units would have been responsible for, so they are getting a break with the change in the MOU. I speak to the wardens and mayors quite often. Matter of fact, I saw the warden for Colchester County just recently. He didn't raise any issue around the MOU causing them to raise taxes. So I would say that the member opposite is right in one thing, that the things I say do add up, which is contrary to the things he says. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, early diagnosis of cystic fibrosis greatly impacts the quality of life of affected individuals. Screening newborns for cystic fibrosis would have an incredible impact on both the day-to-day lives of patients and the costs associated with their care. Studies reveal there's a significant difference between those who are screened at birth and those who are diagnosed in a clinical setting. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. When will Nova Scotia follow the example set by other provinces and include cystic fibrosis among the disorders screened for in our newborn screening service?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for a very important question. Mr. Speaker, I believe that there are really only a few provinces that are currently doing this particular test. Mr. Speaker, we are looking at what is happening elsewhere. We have a very good screening program in Nova Scotia where we do, in fact, screen newborns for, I think the staff in the department told me, more than 30-some different disorders, and we will continue to gather the scientific information with respect to this particular procedure and what the cost and the impact might be. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria de Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, cystic fibrosis patients are used to frequent hospital stays, on top of dealing with both intravenous antibiotics and a host of other drugs. Each year we spend over $1 million on these drugs alone. A report from the Health Department indicates that an average of $7,443 is spent on each patient every year. In examining the total cost of care for an individual with CF, inpatient hospitalization is not factored in, though it represents up to 47% of the cost. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister. Can the Minister explain why her government would rather cut frontline services in areas like health and education instead of being proactive like some of our fellow provincial governments?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, there have been no cuts to frontline services in the Department of Health in this province. And, Mr. Speaker, if members of the third party want to sit down and examine the Health Department's budget. The Health Department's budget continues to grow and has grown by millions of dollars in each of the 3 years we've brought budgets forward. In fact, in this year, the Health Department's budget is growing by 2.5%, Mr. Speaker. So we continue to invest in health care. We invest strategically in the area of health care. We have priorities. We are investing in better care sooner for people, collaborative care practices, and keeping emergency rooms open around the province, reducing wait times, Mr. Speaker, and soon in a mental health strategy. So these are our government's priorities, and we will continue to focus on them, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria de Lakes on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important that the government consider newborn screening for CF as a priority as well, but they're not doing that. Mr. Speaker, cost savings aside, the department should adapt testing solely based on the fact that cystic fibrosis patients are reported as having a better quality of life. An American study indicated that children diagnosed after undergoing newborn screening have benefited from better lung function and body mass index. In Ontario, Mr. Speaker, the screening program was implemented to avoid frequent infection and long-term damage to the lungs. So my final question to the Minister is, can the Minister explain to this House why an opportunity to save money and lives is not attractive to her government?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, with respect to screening and the cystic fibrosis issue, it's something that we will certainly examine and are examining. But, Mr. Speaker, the decisions that will be made with respect to investing in this will be based on the scientific information. And the screening, as I understand in Ontario, is relatively new, and we will take a look at what the impact is in Ontario and whether or not it in fact contributes to better outcomes for CF patients and has a positive financial impact on the system.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, with upcoming changes to old age security in the most recent Harper Conservative budget, Nova Scotians are concerned that they are going to be left behind. Old age security is especially important to low-income households, and these changes will have a disproportionate impact on those with little or no savings, those unable to replace OAS with some other type of employment income, and those with very physically demanding jobs. This will also have a direct impact on the cost for services provided to these people by the provincial government. My question for the Minister of Finance is, has the Minister estimated the effect of these changes on the future spending requirements of the province?
Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for a very good question. She asked the same question in estimates, and for the benefit of the House, I'll give the same answer. This is an extremely important issue. The change of the qualifying age for old age security from 65 to 67 has enormous implications throughout government. To name only a few, the ones the member mentioned: community services, workers' compensation, all public and private pension plans, because so much is geared towards the age 65. With all members of the House, we need to work our way towards this, but it is quite a large, significant undertaking to figure out exactly what the implications are, and we are working on that, and we'll continue to work on that. And when we have those results, which I don't expect to be for some time, we'll certainly share that with the House, because it affects so very many people in this province.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Minister said, there's going to be programs like workers' comp, community services, and many others that are going to cost the province of Nova Scotia more money if there's a 2-year gap that will have to be funded for. So my question to the Minister is has he begun to calculate the impact of those changes so that we can take that message about how detrimental it is to Nova Scotia directly back to the federal government so that they know of our objections? So has he begun to calculate it?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a very significant policy undertaking. By way of comparison, I would just remind the member that over the entire time that I've been the Minister of Finance, the federal, provincial, territorial finance ministers have been working on a retirement income adequacy project, which took an enormous amount of effort on the part of all governments. A great deal of staff time was devoted to it, and regrettably, mainly because of the federal government, the issue is no longer really on the table, and I think that's very regrettable. But one thing that I did learn from that whole project was just how complex the issue of retirement income adequacy is, and this adds another dimension to an already very complicated area. We are working on it. We will continue to work on it, but it certainly is not something that we would get the full picture on just between the time of the announcement in the federal budget and now.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that concerns me particularly about the coming change, and I recognize it's some years off, but I think that we cannot be too quick in starting to signal our concern about it. But one of the big concerns is the current government's and really I think the province's interest in the trades and trade training. And we know that if we're going to have the jobs that are coming with the shipbuilding project, a lot of those are going to be heavy, hard construction jobs that take their toll on workers. It's harder for them to work up to 65, let alone an additional 2 years. So the impact will be felt greatly, I think, in the trades area. So with all of this in mind, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance if he has done anything yet as part of the federal, provincial, territorial group, or as the Minister of Finance for Nova Scotia, has he signalled in any way to the federal government that these changes are going to be very detrimental, and that we are really strongly objecting to them?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The next meeting of the federal, provincial, territorial finance ministers is in June, or at least we expect it in June, because the date is essentially set by the federal government, and they did cancel one meeting without consulting with the provinces. But we do expect the next one will be in June, and I do expect that this topic will be on the agenda. But like the whole retirement income adequacy project, it is not the sort of thing that gets dealt with or resolved at a single meeting. It's going to take a great deal of staff time in every jurisdiction to figure out all the implications and consequences. But I do thank the member for raising the issue today. It is a very, very important issue for many Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission. Mr. Speaker, we all know the value of leading by example. And Mr. Speaker, there would be no greater example than one which highlights a public service that is truly inclusive of all people and accurately reflects the population it serves. We all know Nova Scotia has the highest rate of disabilities in Canada, a rate which currently stands at 20%. So my first question to the Minister is, what percentage of the public service is made up of persons who have identified themselves with a disability?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a very good question. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the answer right at my fingertips, but I will endeavour to get that for the member as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his first supplementary.
And I thank the Minister for his commitment. Mr. Speaker, there's no question government programs are needed to support programs with disabilities. More important, however, Mr. Speaker, are the huge benefits that can be achieved when a person with a disability is able to demonstrate that if given the opportunity, they are willing, able, and very capable members of any workforce, and that includes the public service. While I can appreciate that this information may not be readily available, I'm wondering if the Minister could advise the House of the number of applicants and interviews granted for individuals who identified themselves with a disability in 2011-2012 fiscal year.
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, and thank the member again for the question, Mr. Speaker. That's a very wide-ranging question. I think the member realizes that. Again, I would not have that right at my fingertips, member, but through you, Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to get those answers. I would expect it would be somewhat difficult, the ones that actually get to the interview process, but we'll do our best to get as accurate a number as we can for you as quickly as we can.
The Honourable Member for Clare on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank the Minister for looking into this and providing us with the information at his earliest convenience. Mr. Speaker, the success of ensuring a truly diverse workforce is ensuring that applications and interviews result in hiring. So my final question to the Minister is, of the number of applicants and interviews granted for persons who have self-identified as having a disability, how many were hired in the last year?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I get so few questions on it, and yet I got so few answers, and I apologize to the member for that, Mr. Speaker. But what I do agree with, Mr. Speaker, and I think every member of this House agrees with the ability of diversity and with people with disabilities, that the government show leadership and be a leader in all of this, Mr. Speaker. And we will do that, and I will give my word through you, Mr. Speaker, to that member. We will get this information to him as quickly as we can, and I thank him again for his question because it's a very good question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tri-County Regional School Board is facing some difficult decisions. Because of the NDP government's $65 million in cuts to public education, the school board is looking at cutting 11 teachers from our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. The superintendent of the board has said, despite what this minister says, any reductions will have impacts on services and supports to schools. And I'll table those comments, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister think that cutting 11 teaching positions won't impact the classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I trust that Tri-County made the decisions in the best interest of the students in the classroom. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
The decisions of this government has placed a $2.5 million shortfall in the budget for the Tri-County School Board, Mr. Speaker. As a result, they are forced to cut teaching positions, something that this minister said would not happen. This minister continues to fall back on the argument around declining enrollment. However, the real costs of educating our youth don't tie into enrollment numbers, Mr. Speaker. So will the minister admit to parents in the Tri-Counties that just because enrollment's going down doesn't mean the cost of our education is?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm a bit confused because as requested, school boards were to look at retirements and attrition, and it is my understanding that Tri-County was able to meet their budget obligation without laying or cutting anybody. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Tri-County School Board is facing a $2.5 million deficit in funding as a result of this government's decisions. They are eliminating 11 teaching positions from the Tri-Counties, and there's nobody in the right mind that will say that's not going to impact the classroom, Mr. Speaker. It's going to. Mr. Speaker, the students in Tri-County Regional School Board need the Minister of Education to be a leader of education and to advocate for them at the cabinet table. Instead, she puts hundreds of thousands of dollars into political advertising and over $500,000 into lunch bags with hacky sacks, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister stand in the House today and tell parents and students in the Tri-County Regional School Board that she will advocate for public education and call on her cabinet colleagues to restore funding to our schools so that we don't lose any teaching positions, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are making an investment in our students all across Nova Scotia, and we are dealing with a challenge, and that is declining enrollment. We are increasing our spending per student. I would like to say that I am making sure that school boards that are adversely affected by a steep declining enrollment have been protected. We did put a cap of 2.1 on Tri-County. Their enrollment decline for the coming year is 3.2. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP have driven rural Nova Scotia to its deathbed, and now they want to kill it. Unless, of course, it's in the Deputy Premier's constituency. Mr. Speaker, we now know that 36 Department of Justice jobs moved to New Waterford were not from Halifax at all. They were from parts of rural Nova Scotia and other economically disadvantaged regions. The reality is the NDP have not created one new single job in rural Nova Scotia. They've only shuffled a handful around. Simply put, the NDP's job creation plan for Nova Scotia can be compared to rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is, given that not a single new job has been created for rural Nova Scotians under this NDP government, and the job losses actually range in the thousands, will the minister finally be honest and straightforward with rural Nova Scotians and admit that they are simply not a priority for this NDP government?
Order, please. That is unparliamentary and out of order. For to finally be honest, yes, it is. The impunity of the minister. I'd ask the honourable member to please rephrase that question, please.
Will the minister finally be straightforward with Nova Scotians?
Thank you.
And admit they are simply not a priority for this NDP government?
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's certainly at every opportunity I get, I enjoy getting on my feet and having the opportunity to talk about the progress that this province is making in jobs and growing the economy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has made investments in every region of the province of Nova Scotia. We continue to make those investments. We want Nova Scotians to have the right skills for the good jobs that are being created in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is well positioned, not only for today, but well into the future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, people in Amherst, New Glasgow and Kentville are all paying the price of the NDP's reckless economic mismanagement today. These communities have already suffered enough damage under the NDP's watch. Closed businesses, lost jobs, and an inattentive Minister of Economic Development. However, it appears the NDP are ready to pay lots of attention to the Deputy Premier's riding. My question is, why is the job in New Waterford more valuable to the NDP government than a job in New Glasgow, Kentville or Amherst?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I hear a question like that, Mr. Speaker, I'm curious because you know, we've made investments, and I've mentioned already once in this House, Mr. Speaker, about the investment we made in Bill Did It, which is in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. Poirier's boat building, Mr. Speaker, also in Cape Breton. TriStar business in Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on. Over 200 investments that we've made in businesses here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we've taken 20 years of being ignored, and we've turned it around.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how many actual jobs were created in Cape Breton since this government has taken power? The numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Speaker. Royal Nova Scotia is down 8,000 jobs. And the NDP, in particular, this Minister of Economic Development, have done nothing, Mr. Speaker, absolutely nothing for Royal Nova Scotia. We've seen businesses from one end of the province to the other close. We've seen vital links to nearby economies eliminated. And we've seen more and more young people forced out of rural communities they've called home in search of work. More people are leaving Royal Nova Scotia to work out west, Mr. Speaker, than ever. Mr. Speaker, my question, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development admit that his disastrous policies and gross neglect have driven Royal Nova Scotia into a recession?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, when I...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
We are putting jobs in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, not taking them out.
The time allotted for oral questions put by ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to table a document regarding some questions that the member from Clare asked me, and I said I would get back to him. These are in response to your first question, member, and I'll try and endeavour to get the rest for the two supplementaries.
Thank you. I will now recognize the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd call private members' public bills for second reading.
Private members' bills for second reading?
Yes, thank you. I'll call Bill number 45, the Ratepayer Protection Act.
Bill 45, the Ratepayer Protection Act. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please to rise on this opposition day to speak to Bill 45, the Ratepayers Protection Act. And I first wanted to outline what this actual bill does encompass. And it is to conduct the bill will require Nova Scotia Power to conduct biannual performance and value for money audits, which will be made public, to publish estimated and actual costs on a regular basis, require public settlement meetings before any proposed general rate hike, and it will prevent millions in executive bonuses and regulatory costs being passed on to ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, this is, again, a bill and a mechanism whereby we can actually work to get stabilized power rates in our province. We pay some of the highest rates in Canada, and over the last 10 years, electricity rates have increased 7 times. It has become now almost an expectation that in Nova Scotia, over 400,000 households, businesses will actually get an annual power increase. And now Nova Scotia Power has sought another large increase on the backs of customers. We have, of course, a 20% increase in just 2 of those 7 years. And we have seen power rates increase, dig deeper into the pockets